Losing a child in a crowd has to be one of the greatest nightmares for any parent. If you've been a parent or taken a nephew or niece or grandchild to a mall, you know the feeling. When kids are little, the world in a mall looks like a sea of legs and bums, and it's so easy to get lost and disoriented. And when they're older, of course, as teenagers, it's easy to see things which look interesting and just wander off, and suddenly you find yourself missing one or two teenagers, and it can take a while to get them back. Kids aching for independence can easily wander off, and it's one of those things which just makes your heart sink when it happens. And that must have been the feeling that Mary and Joseph were going through when they realized that Jesus was missing. Like all observant Jews of that time, they would make a yearly pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover. And because they came from the village of Nazareth, which was a Jewish village, everybody would have gone. They all would have gone down in the spring. And so when it was time to go back, the whole town probably walked back together. It wasn't a very big town. So a crowd of 100, 150 people would go in little groups. And back then, you know that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it was really true back then. So Mary and Joseph had every reason to believe that Jesus was probably just walking with some of the other tweens or teenagers. And so it makes sense that it would take a day before they realized, oh, wait a second, he's not actually here with us. And now they have two problems. One is a practical one. Jesus, no doubt, has a problem in the village. He's 12 years old. He's in Jerusalem, which at Passover can swell to be hundreds of thousands of people. He hasn't planned on staying for 3 or 4 days. So there's no way he has enough money to stay in an inn or to buy food for himself for 4 days. So Mary and Joseph have every reason to be afraid that he's got a whole bunch of practical problems, which he's just a young child. He's not going to know how to fix, and he probably doesn't have any family there. They're all on the road going back to Nazareth, extended family and friends. So what's he going to do? So that's one aspect of it. There's a genuine fear for what's really happening to him. But of course, fear isn't just about an accurate assessment of what's happening to someone. It's also about what could happen. Fear has a vivid imagination. We've all been through this. And for Mary and Joseph, what's probably running through their mind is, what if he gets kidnapped? What if some of the Roman soldiers who are in town to keep the peace over Passover decide to pull him aside and do goodness knows what to him? How is he going to eat? How is he going to sleep? And unfortunately, Joseph and Mary have a long time to worry about this. They're a day out from Jerusalem when they realize that Jesus is missing, which means that it'll take them a day to get back. And then we're told by Luke that it takes another 3 days before they actually find Jesus. So that's either 3 or 4 days. That's a long time to be afraid. And for 2 or 3 days in Jerusalem to pass searching for Jesus, that's enough time for your imagination, for your fear to go to all sorts of places. Last week, on my vacation camping, I had an encounter with getting lost and with the fear that goes with it. I was on vacation, camping in Algonquin Park with my wife. Algonquin Park, if you don't know, is about three hours north of Toronto. It's a huge area. The park is bigger than the entire GTA. My wife and I like camping, and we really love hiking. So we set out to hike every day. And we got lucky. The weather cooperated, mostly. As I mentioned earlier, there was a fair bit of rain that week, so one of the things which happens when it rains is that the paths which go up, because a lot of Algonquin's paths take you up, there's hills 500 meters above sea level there, those paths that take you up become de facto creeks, so often there's water running through creeks, and it can get pretty messy. And sometimes you come across a part where the path is so completely inundated with water that you just got to go around, or you've got to hop from rock to rock. I find that interesting. Other people might find that intimidating or difficult. On the third day that we were hiking, we came across a low-lying area that had become a bog. It used to be a straight path, but now it was just this swamp. There was no going straight through the path, so we needed to find our way around. And you could see that people had tried this in a couple of different ways. There was a sort of muddy track to the right, and then on the left, there were a couple of logs that were lined up good enough that if you sort of walked over tightrope style, you could get to the other side, which is about 5 or 6 meters on the other side. My wife Amanda took the muddy track first and then gave up because it was just too yucky. Meanwhile, I started going along the logs. And we had poles, so we weren't in much danger of falling over. So I went across the logs first, and then Amanda, seeing that it worked for me, she did the same thing. And as she was going across, she looked down, because that's where you're looking when you're going across this, and she saw a phone, a mobile phone. She picked it up and said, "Is this yours?" And fortunately, it wasn't. So she got across the other side, and suddenly we had this person's phone. So one of the hikers must have dropped their phone as they were doing exactly what we were doing. So for the rest of the hike, which took us up 500 meters, every time we caught up with people who were, sitting at a lookout or having lunch or having a rest, we asked them if they'd lost their phone. No one had. When we got back to our car, we opened up the phone. We found it was still on, and there was no password on it. And we discovered it belonged to a woman called Sandra, and we could see that she had a calendar notification for which park she was staying at, which wasn't Algonquin, it was another one. And we could see from her top contacts who her top friends were. So this is the downside. This is the upside of not having a password on your phone. So we called a couple of them. And not too long after, once we were back at our camp, one of her friends called us back. And it turned out that the owner, Sandra, had dropped her phone the day before when she was hiking in the park. She'd been hiking this 10-kilometer long hike, which usually takes about, according to the guidebook, it should take 6 hours. It took us 4. She was doing it in reverse. So she would have come to that bog near the end, about 3 kilometers short of the end of the hike. Trick was that she started at 6 o'clock in the evening for what in the book says is a 6-hour hike. And so by the time she got to that bog, according to her friend, it was dark, and she kept going, and then she realized she'd lost her phone. It was dark, and she was stuck. She got lost. She didn't know where she was. She couldn't see the trail, which, as I've said, is difficult to see because of all the water anyway. And so, according to her friend, she spent the night in the woods. Now, this is every hiker's worst nightmare, to get so lost that you get stuck in the woods and you have to spend overnight. When we heard this, we were horrified. When we first arrived at the camp, we were told that there are packs of wolves and there are many black bears. And during our course of being at the camp, we saw signs up saying black bear has been spotted. The last time Amanda had been at Algonquin Park, a black bear had walked straight through her campsite. So there's nothing theoretical about black bears. So we were very, very scared on her behalf. And of course, we wanted to get her phone back to her. I mean, after all this, the least she could do is have her phone. Her friend said that she'd met up with her. She had reached her car after a long night out, and had got to her campsite. So we told the friend our phone number, and we said, well, apparently they were going to get together soon, so please let her know that we've got her phone, and we'd love to give it back to her. When Jesus went missing, Mary and Joseph had to live with their fear for 3 or 4 days. The depth of that fear is clear when Mary finally catches up with Jesus in the temple. And here's Holman Hunt's famous painting of the scene. Mary says to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." Jesus just shrugs and simply says, "Why were you so worried? Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house?" In typical teenager fashion, Jesus assumes that his parents will know his reality intimately without having any reason to know it, right? Teenagers always think that you can read their minds, and they get mad at you for not being able to do so. So he says, "Hey, why didn't you know I was going to be here? It was obvious I was always going to be here." This explanation leaves out a lot of details, of course, like where Jesus slept and where he ate. But what the gospel writer Luke wants us to understand is that even as a 12-year-old, even before he was baptized, Jesus was the Son of God. He'd been dazzling the elders with his questions and his understanding about Jewish law and ethics. And even before he receives the Holy Spirit in baptism, Luke wants us to know that he's already imbued with a closeness to God. And in fact, the way he responds to Mary is a clue to what kind of closeness that is. He says, "Why didn't you understand? Of course, I was going to be in my Father's house." My Father's house. That's not the way most Jews would refer to the temple, and they certainly wouldn't refer at that time to God as Father. Father's an intimate term. You can sit on your father's knee. If you read the Hebrew Scriptures, most of the time God is referred to as a sort of distant king or an absentee landlord, a sovereign, but a father, someone who you can touch and cuddle with? No. God is too powerful and scary for that in the Hebrew Scriptures. And yet here's Jesus saying, of course I'm in my Father's house, because he feels that intimacy with God. Jesus in his ministry introduces the idea of God as a loving parent, the kind who would spend days searching for you if you got lost. And of course, famously in the Lord's Prayer, it starts with, "Our Father who art in heaven." But this boy Jesus is saying something else to his mother as well. He's saying, I was never lost. He was always right where he should be, safe in his Father's house. In this instance, his Father's house means the temple. But when Jesus grows up and starts his ministry, he teaches his disciples and us that God's house is not just the temple, because of course that comes down. God's house is everywhere. It's on those dusty roads that he walked in Galilee. It's in the house of a sinner where he has dinner. And it's even out in the wilderness where he encounters the demon that wants to tempt him away from his ministry. Your Father's house, God's house, is all of the earth if you're open to God's Spirit, which seeks to dwell in you. It took a day before the woman who had lost her phone finally caught up with us and drove into our campsite. Sandra was about that high and a total bundle of energy. We gave her her phone. She was extremely thankful, and we invited her to sit down, and so she had a seat in our camp, and she told us her story. And the first thing she told us was, Kramer from the Seinfeld series? Well, I'm the female Kramer. And she said this with a great big laugh. She told us that the day that she got lost, she'd made a mistake. She was staying at another provincial park south of Algonquin, and she'd driven up wanting to do some hiking, and she'd done a couple of short hikes. And she got it in her head that the next hike, the one that we were on, Centennial Ridge, by the way, was just a 45-minute long hike. Whereas, in fact, what was true was it was a 45-minute drive from where she was to where Centennial Ridge was. So she starts hiking, and she's got a little dog with her, and they hike, and then, of course, by the time she gets there at 6 o'clock, and she doesn't realize that she's lost her phone in that boggy spot where we found it, but she realizes that it's getting dark, and she gets lost on the trail, and she doesn't know where she is, and it occurs to her, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to sleep outside. And so she tells us she cut down some branches from some evergreen trees, and she made a mattress out of branches, and she cut down some more, apologizing to the trees, she said, each time she did it, and she put them on top of her. She stuffed her little dog under her sweatshirt and curled up next to a pond she'd found under the stars, and that's where she slept. And we asked her, well, were you scared? And her answer just floored us, and she said, no, I wasn't scared. She explained that she'd grown up in Kirkland Lake, well north of Toronto. And there she knew what black bears and wolves were about. They don't really want to deal with people at all. We're not their food. And so the chances of a black bear coming and giving her grief was negligible, and same thing with the wolves. They wouldn't want anything to do with her. All she had to do was be quiet and have a sleep, and it'll be fine, she said. And fortunately, that night wasn't a rainy night. There were other rainy nights during that week, but not that one. So she said any fear that we had on her account was unnecessary. She was fine. In an email later on, I asked for permission to share her story, and she gave it. And I also asked her, was there any spiritual dimension to this experience that she'd had? And she explained that she has a close relationship with God, and this certainly wasn't the worst experience she'd ever had. And this is what she told me in that email. I prayed once I realized that I would be spending the night there. I simply asked for Him, God, to protect us, and then asked what was the lesson I was supposed to be learning. I instantly knew that I had absolutely nothing to worry about. I was overcome with the feeling that I could do this, that it was going to be okay, and that I was going to make it out. There was just no question about it. I felt calm and at peace. I tried to see the positive side of the situation. I had a clear sky full of stars. I was right on a beautiful pond. Had a woodpecker serenading me all night long, and it didn't rain. Bonus. It went quickly. I viewed the stars and beautiful moon we had that night, and again thanked the Lord for making such wonderful, amazing things in life and giving me the opportunity to see it. Sandra was able to sleep because she wasn't consumed by fear. Fear has its uses. It can give us the strength to run away from danger, and it can give us the strength to fight back if we need to. But that other kind of fear, the kind of fear that Mary had when Jesus was lost, the kind of fear that we have when people go missing or we imagine the worst, that one can be debilitating. It can cause us to worry for days and weeks and months and sometimes even years on end. And that can wear you down, mentally and physically too. Prolonged stress and fear are bad for your immune system. That kind of fear is truly an enemy, yet one that many live with. But when I hear Sandra's words, I'm struck by her lack of fear. She was confident she was safe, but the reality of her situation did not merit fear. She felt like she was in her Father's house, safe under the stars and moon, lucky to see these glorious sights. She told us that if it weren't against the rules, we should sneak in and sleep next to that pond. It's a really lovely spot. Sandra knew that when you know you are in God's house, even in the middle of nowhere, then you can set your fear aside. Faith replaces fear, and it's a much better companion. It can give you the strength to sit still, be confident and safe. It can give you the peace of mind to be open, to wonder at the grace and beauty of what's around us, even in the darkest places. Knowing that you are in God's house means that you can feel at home everywhere. And that is a great gift indeed. Amen.